Born into absolute luxury, he was the cherished future of the French monarchy. Yet by age 4, this same child was strapped to a chair, enduring red-hot iron rods pressed directly into his skull. He was Monsieur d'Orléans. Why did the ultimate royal privilege become his most brutal death sentence? Let's step back to the year 1607. The world that welcomed this child was fraught with both opulence and danger. France was just beginning to recover from decades of brutal, exhausting religious wars. King Henri IV, the first of the Bourbon monarchs, had forced a peace upon his fractured country. He was charismatic and powerful, but he knew the fragility of a new ruling family. A king required heirs to secure the throne. His first son, the future Louis XIII, was born in 1601, securing the immediate succession. But a dynasty requires more than one son to survive the lethal realities of the 17th century. When Queen Marie de Médicis gave birth to a second boy on the 16th of April, 1607, the French court erupted in celebration. The child was immediately granted the prestigious title of Duke of Orléans. Following the strict traditions of the court, he was simply called Monsieur d'Orléans. For the 4 brief years he survived, this title was the only name he ever truly possessed. His early years were spent in an environment of staggering opulence. He was healthy, active, and a cherished member of the large royal nursery. But the splendor of the French court hid a terrifying vulnerability. The 17th century was an era of profound scientific ignorance regarding human biology. It was a time that could navigate oceans and build magnificent palaces, yet remained entirely powerless against the microscopic threats that haunted those very halls. Medical practice was rooted in ancient Greek theories, completely isolated from empirical science. Cleanliness was not linked to health, and physical pain was viewed as an inevitable component of life, even for a king. In this world, a minor infection could easily destroy a royal bloodline. The tragedy of Monsieur d'Orléans began subtly. For the first 2 years of his life, he developed normally, but as he approached his 3rd birthday, deeply concerning symptoms began to manifest. In a common household, this would cause panic. In a royal household, it was a crisis of state. We know the excruciating details of his decline because of one man, Jean Henri. He was the king's first physician, tasked with keeping a meticulous daily journal on the health of the royal children. Henri did not merely record illnesses. He documented every meal, every bowel movement, every mood swing, and eventually every moment of the prince's agony. His diary provides a chilling first-hand account of a methodical professional who was devastatingly wrong. Henri recorded that the little prince's head began to grow excessively large. Modern medicine easily recognizes this as hydrocephalus, a condition where cerebrospinal fluid builds up in the cavities of the brain, increasing pressure inside the skull. As the internal pressure mounted, the child suffered violent convulsions. He began to lose his sight. He experienced opisthotonos, a severe muscle spasm that arched his spine backwards, freezing his small body in an agonizing curve. Henri noted his observations clearly. The head was as large as a pumpkin, the eyes were protruding, and the child's hands were clenched so tightly that the fingers could not be pried apart. Faced with these terrifying symptoms, Henri relied on the only medical framework he knew, humorism. This ancient theory argued that human health was governed by the balance of 4 vital fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Henri diagnosed the prince with a massive accumulation of cold phlegmatic humors in his brain. According to this logic, the excess phlegm was pressing down on the nerves and causing the seizures and the swelling. The doctors had no concept of cerebrospinal fluid or the actual anatomy of the brain's ventricles. They saw a plumbing problem. The prescribed solution was to evacuate the stagnant fluid at all costs. This diagnosis set the stage for what was known as heroic medicine, a term used for extreme aggressive treatments meant to shock the body back into balance. For Monsieur d'Orléans, the doctors decided that the most effective way to dry up the cold humors was through the application of intense heat. They would burn the child's skull to create a permanent wound, an exit point for the supposed toxic phlegm. The treatment was far more dangerous than the disease. From late 1610 until his death in 1611, the young prince was subjected to a systematic regimen of cauterization. The scale of this intervention was immense. It was a public affair within the court driven by desperation. King Henri IV had been assassinated earlier in 1610, leaving the kingdom unstable. The Queen Regent, Marie de Médicis, was desperate to keep her remaining sons alive and approved these extreme measures, believing them to be the only viable cure. The procedure was clinical and brutal. The royal barber surgeon would shave the child's head completely. The toddler was then strapped securely to a custom-made high-backed chair. Servants, or perhaps Henri himself, held the child's head perfectly still to prevent any sudden movement. There was no anesthetic available. The pain would be absolute. A portable forge filled with burning charcoal was brought into the room. Heavy iron rods were placed into the coals until they glowed white hot, reaching temperatures well over 800 degrees Celsius. Henri's own journal details the grim reality. He wrote of applying a red-hot iron, thick as a finger, directly onto the child's skull. He deliberately targeted the coronal suture, the joint across the top of the head, pressing the searing metal into the skin and bone for sustained periods. The smell of burning flesh filled the room. Henri noted the creation of deep ishars, thick crusts of dead burned tissue that penetrated entirely through the scalp down to the membrane surrounding the brain. Historians reading these accounts estimate that the irons were held in place for 20 to 30 minutes across multiple points during a single session. The trauma inflicted on the 4-year-old is difficult to comprehend. Yet, Henri recorded a disturbing detail. After the procedure, the child would sometimes chuckle and ask for his toys while his devastating burns were being dressed. In the 17th century, this was interpreted as royal bravery. Today, medical professionals recognize it as profound physiological shock. The 3rd-degree burns had likely destroyed his nerve endings, and his small body was flooded with adrenaline and endorphins, inducing a state of neurological apathy just to survive the unbearable trauma. The cauterization failed entirely. Instead of curing the child, it accelerated his decline. The burns massively increased the internal pressure and the frequency of his convulsions. The irons thinned his skull dangerously and created massive open wounds that practically invited severe infection. Henri, attempting to release a mythical fluid, was actively destroying the child's head. When the iron failed to produce the desired result, Henri turned to chemical corrosion. He prescribed the use of cantharides, a potent toxin derived from the crushed bodies of the Spanish fly blister beetle. In 17th century medicine, this was a highly valued vesicant used to create massive blisters that would theoretically draw out bad humors through the skin. The shaved, scarred scalp of the prince was coated in a thick paste made of the crushed beetles and wax. His head was bandaged tightly, and he was left to wait for up to 24 hours. As the chemical reaction took hold, the prince endured a slow, intensifying, burning agony as the outer layers of his skin liquefied into large, painful blisters. Once the bandages were removed, Henri would methodically pierce each blister with a sharp needle, squeezing out the clear serum. The doctor celebrated this as the toxic phlegm leaving the body. In reality, he was draining the child's vital lymph fluid and severely compromising his immune system. This chemical treatment plunged the child into further distress. He suffered from high fevers, relentless vomiting, and severe agitation. Furthermore, cantharidin is highly toxic to the kidneys. As the chemical absorbed through his raw scalp, it slowly poisoned his renal system. The child began to suffer from severe fluid retention and decreased urine output. Henri was inadvertently causing systemic organ failure while trying to cure a fundamental misunderstanding of human anatomy. By the autumn of 1611, the continuous cycle of burning and blistering had ruined the prince's body. He could barely speak, and his vision was gone entirely. He suffered multiple violent seizures daily, leaving him exhausted and limp. Yet, the medical interventions never ceased. Henri continued to apply blisters, and even used the hot irons again to try and stimulate the failing child. The doctors treated the theory of humorism, completely blind to the agonizing reality of the patient in front of them. As the continuous cycle of burning and blistering ruined the prince's body, he remained trapped in a horrifying paradox. He was a prince who possessed every advantage the 17th century could offer, yet his privilege only ensured that he received the most aggressive, destructive medical care available. His immense social status demanded that no expense be spared and no treatment, no matter how agonizing, be withheld. The terrifying medical machine that caused his suffering did not pause for a single moment, fueled by love, desperation, and absolute medical dogma. How was this tragedy permitted and rigorously documented by the highest authorities in the land? We must look closely at the walls that confined him and the people who held the instruments of his torment. The story of Monsieur d'Orléans is inextricably linked to the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Located just west of Paris, perched on a terrace overlooking the River Seine, this sprawling palace served as the designated royal nursery for the children of Henri IV. A royal nursery is often pictured as a place of quiet privilege and gentle care. In the early 17th century, it was closer to a highly surveilled medical fortress. King Henry had decided to raise all his children together in this palace, away from the political intrigue and the fetid, disease-ridden streets of central Paris. This included not only his legitimate children with Queen Marie de Médicis, but also his numerous illegitimate children from various mistresses. It was a chaotic, crowded environment, swarming with wet nurses, governesses, tutors, and guards. At the absolute center of this world was Jean Henri. He was not merely a doctor who visited when a child fell ill. He was the undisputed architect of their daily existence. Henri was an educated man, highly respected in his field, having studied at the prestigious medical faculty in Montpellier. He had served under previous kings and was deeply entrenched in the rigid dogmas of his profession. When Henri IV appointed him to oversee the royal nursery, Henri took the responsibility with a level of obsession that borders on the unfathomable. He initiated a daily journal, a massive multi-volume document that survives to this day. In it, he recorded the minutiae of the royal children's lives with forensic detachment. He noted the exact times they woke, the precise composition of their meals, their temper tantrums, their vocabulary, and most significantly, their bodily functions. Every cough, every flush of the skin, and every bowel movement was analyzed and recorded. This intense surveillance was rooted in the absolute belief that the human body was constantly on the verge of dangerous humoral imbalance. Henri believed that by monitoring these tiny fluctuations, he could predict and prevent illness. Life for Monsieur d'Orléans, even before his fatal symptoms appeared, was dictated by this obsessive oversight. The children were subjected to regular purges and enemas as preventative measures. If a child seemed slightly lethargic, it was attributed to an excess of phlegm, and a mild purgative was immediately administered to force the bowels to empty. If a child was irritable, it was blamed on yellow bile, and their diet was instantly restricted. Their bodies were not treated as resilient growing systems, but as fragile, defective machines requiring constant, aggressive recalibration. This oppressive atmosphere of medical paranoia was supercharged by the sudden brutal trauma that struck the royal family in May of 1610. King Henri IV, the seemingly invincible warrior king, was assassinated in the streets of Paris by a religious fanatic. A knife to the chest ended his life in moments. The impact of this assassination on the French court cannot be overstated. It plunged the nation into a terrifying uncertainty. For Queen Marie de Médicis, the death of her husband was both a political and a psychological catastrophe. She was suddenly the queen regent, tasked with holding together a volatile country for her 9-year-old son, the new King Louis XIII. She was surrounded by ambitious nobles eager to seize power. Her only true security lay in the survival of her children, particularly her sons. They were the physical anchors of the Bourbon dynasty. If Louis XIII were to die of a childhood illness, a remarkably common occurrence, the crown would pass to his younger brother, Monsieur d'Orléans. This environment of acute political terror perfectly explains the Queen's subsequent actions. When Monsieur d'Orléans began showing symptoms of his neurological condition just months after his father's assassination, Marie de Médicis was not a rational parent evaluating medical options. She was a deeply traumatized widow, terrified of losing her dynasty. She turned to the only source of authority available to her, Jean Henri, and the medical establishment. Henri represented certainty in an uncertain world. He did not offer vague hopes. He offered absolute, unwavering diagnoses based on centuries of accepted academic literature. When he declared that the prince's seizures and swelling head were caused by an accumulation of cold humors, he did so with the full weight of the medical establishment behind him. He provided a clear, actionable plan. The humors must be evacuated through cauterization and blistering. We must also understand a grim paradox of 17th century society. In this era, poverty often offered a strange kind of medical sanctuary. If a peasant child developed hydrocephalus, the parents would have no access to university-trained physicians or expensive apothecaries. The child would likely be kept comfortable, cared for by family, and allowed to succumb to the disease at its natural pace. The intervention would be minimal, and while the death would be tragic, it would not be actively accelerated by torture. Wealth and royalty, however, guaranteed intervention. The fact that Monsieur d'Orléans was a prince of the blood meant that letting nature take its course was viewed as a dereliction of duty. His social status demanded that no expense be spared and no treatment, no matter how agonizing, be withheld. The brutal irony of his life was that his immense privilege was the direct cause of his immense suffering. The expensive consultations, the custom-forged cauterizing irons, the imported Spanish fly for the blistering agents, these were luxuries reserved for the absolute elite. As the autumn of 1610 approached, the court settled into a grim routine. The halls of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, usually echoing with the sounds of a crowded nursery, were increasingly overshadowed by the screams emanating from the young prince's chambers. The treatments moved from theoretical discussions among the doctors to a horrific physical reality. Henri, armed with his theories and backed by a desperate queen, began to orchestrate the systematic dismantling of a child's body in a futile attempt to save his life. The physical space of the nursery transformed to accommodate this escalating medical violence. The rooms once designated for play became surgical theaters, heavy with the scent of burning charcoal and medicinal pastes. As the brutal winter of 1610 set in, the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye became an isolated fortress of suffering. The young king, Louis XIII, only 6 years old himself, was a frequent witness to these horrors. We know from Henri's meticulous records that the king was highly sensitive, often too terrified by the harsh medical treatments inflicted upon himself, such as his own forced enemas and frequent bleedings. To hear the constant agonized screams of his younger brother echoing down the stone corridors must have been profoundly traumatizing. The court, however, demanded stoicism. Royal children were expected to endure physical hardship as a testament to their noble blood, a bizarre conflation of physical resilience with divine right. The torture of Monsieur d'Orléans was therefore not hidden away as a shameful secret. It was a highly visible state-sanctioned procedure observed by courtiers, guards, and a constant rotation of domestic servants who were required to assist in restraining the screaming toddler. Let us examine the precise nature of the blistering agents that were brought into those chambers. The use of Spanish fly was not a new invention, but its application on a child of 3 years old with an already compromised neurological system was exceptionally aggressive. The apothecaries tasked with preparing the treatments sourced the vibrant emerald green beetles, scientifically known as Cantharis vesicatoria. These insects exude a highly toxic substance called cantharidin as a defense mechanism against predators. In the hands of 17th century physicians, this defensive poison became a primary weapon. The apothecaries would crush the dried beetles into a fine, irritating powder. This powder was then heavily mixed into a thick, adhesive base, usually composed of animal fat, beeswax, and pungent resins. The resulting paste was incredibly caustic. When Henri ordered the application of this vesicant, the process was protracted and merciless. The child's scalp, already raw and traumatized from previous treatments, was completely shaved by the royal barber. The heavy, foul-smelling paste was then smeared thickly across the crown of his head. Heavy linen bandages were wrapped tightly around his skull to ensure the paste remained in direct contact, CT, with the skin, trapping the heat and the chemical reaction. The immediate sensation would have been an intense localized heat, swiftly followed by a severe biting pain as the cantharidin began to actively destroy the cellular bonds of the epidermis. The medical logic behind this atrocity was rooted in the ancient Greek concept of derivation and revulsion. Henri and his contemporaries firmly believed that the human body operated as a closed hydraulic system of humors. Because they had diagnosed the prince's enlarged head as a catastrophic pooling of cold, phlegmatic fluid, they reasoned that they had to create a secondary artificial site of massive inflammation to draw the stagnant fluid away from the brain. They were intentionally inducing a localized chemical burn to force the body to push out the corrupted humors through the skin. They wanted the child to blister. The larger the blisters, the more successful they deemed the treatment. For 12 to 24 hours, the toddler was forced to endure the agonizing chemical burn. We can deduce from the physiological responses recorded by Henri, the relentless fevers, the sudden bouts of severe vomiting, the extreme lethargy, that the prince was not merely suffering from localized skin damage. The cantharidin was actively absorbing through the highly vascularized tissue of his scalp directly into his bloodstream. Modern toxicology dictates that even minute amounts of ingested or absorbed cantharidin can cause severe gastrointestinal distress and catastrophic renal failure. The young prince's kidneys were being systematically destroyed by the very medication meant to save his brain. When the allotted time had passed, the removal of the bandages revealed a gruesome sight. The child's scalp would be covered in massive fluid-filled bully, heavy raised blisters stretching across his head. The subsequent procedure was as barbaric as the application. Henri, operating with cold clinical precision, would take a sharp lancet or a heavy silver needle and methodically puncture each blister. The clear serum that wept from the wounds was collected and analyzed, viewed as the victorious extraction of the toxic phlegm. The reality was that Henri was draining the child's essential blood plasma and lymph fluid, critically dehydrating an already malnourished and severely ill toddler. The raw exposed dermis was then dressed with soothing but entirely unsterile ointments made of rose oil or plantain, practically guaranteeing the onset of secondary bacterial infections. This cycle of blistering and draining was not an isolated event. It was a repeated regimen that defined the winter months. And when the blistering failed to halt the progression of the prince's seizures or the growth of his skull, Henri did not question the underlying theory. Instead, he escalated the violence. He concluded that the cold humors were simply too deeply entrenched, too stubborn for the vesicants alone. He required a more direct, forceful method of extraction. He returned to the actual application of fire. The logistics of cauterizing a living, conscious toddler required immense physical force. The custom-made chair to which the prince was strapped was designed specifically to prevent any thrashing that might cause the irons to slip and burn the face or eyes. Thick leather straps secured his small wrists, ankles, and chest. The most critical and most difficult task was immobilizing the head. It is highly probable that specialized head braces or the sheer brute strength of multiple adult men were used to lock the child's skull in place. The irons themselves were forged specifically for medical use. They were not flat branding irons, but often featured rounded or pointed tips designed to bore deeply into the tissue. The charcoal brazier was brought dangerously close to the child, the intense heat radiating against his face before the instruments were even applied. When the glowing metal met the scowl, the destruction of tissue was instantaneous. Henri specifically targeted the cranial sutures, the fibrous joints between the bones of the skull, believing these were the natural exit points for the trapped fluid. By burning deeply into these sutures, he was actively attempting to create a permanent fistula, an open hole straight through to the brain lining. The fact that Henri recorded these events with absolute unwavering confidence is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire historical record. There is no trace of doubt in his diaries, no late-night scribbles of regret or second-guessing. He was a man completely insulated by his own absolute certainty in the classical texts of Galen and Hippocrates. If the patient worsened, it was the fault of the aggressive disease, not the aggressive treatment. The medical establishment of the 17th century was an echo chamber of theoretical dogma, fundamentally hostile to empirical observation. They did not treat the patient, they treated the text, and in doing so they condemned Monsieur d'Orléans to a life that was merely a prolonged, agonizing execution. As the brutal winter of 1610 slowly gave way to the spring of 1611, the gardens of the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye would have begun to bloom, offering the French court a reprieve from the bitter cold. But inside the walls of the royal nursery, the atmosphere grew increasingly claustrophobic and dark. The young prince, now approaching his 4th birthday, was entirely isolated from the changing seasons outside his window. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of his bed and the terrifying wooden chair where his treatments were administered. The heavy velvet tapestries of his chamber were likely kept drawn, not just to trap the heat from the large fireplaces, but to protect his failing eyes. As the internal pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid mounted against his optic nerves, he developed a severe sensitivity to light before the darkness began to close impermanently. The vibrant, bustling life of a royal toddler had been replaced by a twilight existence of perpetual suffering. The daily reality of Monsieur d'Orléans during his final year was defined by sheer terror. We must look past the clinical vocabulary of Jean Henri's journal and reconstruct the sensory and psychological environment of that sick room. It was an environment defined by fear and anticipation. A child of 3 or 4 possesses a highly developed capacity to recognize patterns, even if they lack the vocabulary to articulate their terror. He would have learned to associate the heavy footsteps of the royal surgeons with the imminent arrival of the charcoal brazier. He would have recognized the sharp, pungent smell of the crushed blister beetles as the prelude to hours of burning skin. Modern psychology understands the devastating impact of chronic pain and repeated medical trauma on a developing mind. The prince was trapped in a state of profound, inescapable vulnerability. The adults who in a normal childhood serve as sources of comfort and safety were in his reality the architects of his agony. Henri's notes from this period often describe the child falling into long, unnatural silences, broken only by sudden violent paroxysms. The doctor interpreted this quietness as the cold humors dampening the child's vital spirits, a sign that the thick, sluggish fluids were overwhelming his brain. In truth, this silence was almost certainly a manifestation of learned helplessness and profound physiological exhaustion. The prince's body was constantly fighting a war on multiple fronts. It was battling the underlying hydrocephalus, which was slowly crushing his brain tissue against the inside of his skull, It was battling the systemic toxicity of the cantharidin coursing through his bloodstream, slowly shutting down his kidneys. And it was battling the massive recurring infections blooming across his scarred, open scalp. The energy required simply to survive each day was immense, leaving nothing for speech, play, or interaction. The physical deterioration of the child was catastrophic. The hydrocephalus had caused his head to expand to grotesque proportions, making it impossible for his thin, weakened neck to support the weight. He was entirely bedridden, unable to sit up or walk. The opisthotonos, the severe backwards arching of his spine caused by neurological distress, became more frequent and more rigid. During these spasms, his tiny body would lock into a rigid bow, his head thrown back, his heels driving into the mattress. These seizures could last for agonizingly long periods, leaving his muscles trembling and depleted. To the 17th century observers, these violent physical distortions were terrifying to witness. They were viewed not as neurological symptoms, but as literal physical battles between the body's natural heat and the invading cold humors. And because the doctors perceived a violent internal struggle, they felt entirely justified in meeting it with violent external remedies. The situation was desperate enough that Héroard did not work in total isolation. The conventions of the French court demanded that in cases of severe royal illness, a medical consultation be convened. Other highly esteemed physicians from the Faculty of Medicine in Paris were summoned to Saint-Germain-en-Laye to examine the dying prince. We might hope that a fresh set of eyes or a differently trained mind might have recognized the futility and cruelty of the treatments. We might hope that someone would suggest giving the child peace. But the tragedy of the era was its intellectual uniformity. When these elite physicians arrived, cloaked in their heavy academic robes, they did not challenge Héroard. They gathered around the prince's bed, observed his swollen head, his rigid limbs, and the weeping burns on his scalp, and they engaged in complex theoretical debates in Latin. They discussed the specific qualities of the humors involved, debating whether the phlegm was entirely cold and moist, or if it had mixed with black bile to become cold and dry. They consulted ancient texts and cited the aphorisms of Hippocrates. What they did not do was question the fundamental approach. The medical consensus was absolute. The consultations merely validated Héroard's methods, serving only to suggest minor adjustments to the torture, perhaps applying the hot irons to slightly different points on the skull, or adding a new, more irritating botanical ingredient to the blistering paste. The echo chamber of 17th century medicine was completely sealed. The presence of these other doctors also highlights the intense political pressure surrounding the sickbed. Queen Marie de Médicis was a constant hovering presence. Her desperation was palpable, driven by a mixture of genuine maternal grief and acute political anxiety. The court was rife with whispers and superstitions. When a royal child suffered a sudden, inexplicable, and grotesque decline, the rumors of witchcraft or deliberate poisoning were never far away. The queen needed to demonstrate to the nobility, to foreign ambassadors, and to the people of France that the crown was doing everything within its immense power to save the Duke of Orléans. In a grim way, the extreme violence of the medical treatment served a political purpose. If the prince had been simply kept comfortable and allowed to die quietly, the queen and her physicians might have been accused of negligence or worse, complicity in his death. The cauterization, the bleeding, the violent purging, these were highly visible, expensive, and aggressive actions. They were performative acts of medical devotion. The prince's suffering became a public display of the monarchy's commitment to its bloodline. The queen's refusal to halt the treatments, even as they clearly accelerated her son's decline, was rooted in a terrifying cognitive dissonance. To stop the irons and the chemicals would be to admit defeat, to admit that the greatest minds in France were powerless, and to accept the death of her child. As long as the doctors were actively doing something, no matter how horrific, the illusion of hope could be maintained. As the summer of 1611 arrived, the heat within the palace would have compounded the misery of the sick room. The heavy bandages encasing the prince's head, soaked in serum and medicinal pastes, would have become unbearable. The open wounds on his scalp, repeatedly burned and blistered, were now deeply infected. Hérouard's journal notes the foul, putrid smell emanating from the child's head, which the doctors confidently diagnosed as the corrupted humors finally beginning to vent. In reality, it was the smell of necrotic tissue and rampant bacterial infection spreading through the bone of his skull. The treatments had effectively breached the body's natural defenses, providing a direct pathway for pathogens to reach the meninges, the protective membranes surrounding the brain. Furthermore, the cumulative effect of the cantharides poisoning was now undeniable, even if the doctors entirely misunderstood the symptoms. Hérouard recorded that the prince's limbs began to swell significantly, the flesh becoming puffy and retaining an indentation when pressed. This edema was a classic sign of end-stage renal failure. His kidneys, heavily damaged by the toxic load of the blister beetles, could no longer filter waste or regulate fluids. The water that should have been expelled as urine was now pooling in his tissues. The child was effectively drowning from the inside out, a direct physiological consequence of the medicine designed to save him. The young prince had been reduced to a fragile shell, entirely consumed by pain and medical interventions. He could no longer see the faces of the people restraining him. He could no longer articulate his terror. His days were measured out in the intervals between paroxysms and the applicatae, on of fresh torments. The royal nursery, meant to be the secure heart of the Bourbon dynasty, had become a site of relentless, state-sponsored execution, carried out with the very best intentions by the most educated men of the age. The final months of his life would test the limits of human endurance, as the physicians, blind to their own devastating errors, prepared for one last desperate offensive against the inevitable. The late summer of 1611 brought a stifling heat to the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, trapping the stagnant air within the stone walls of the royal nursery. For the young Duke of Orleans, now entirely blind and largely paralyzed by the mounting pressure within his skull, the changing seasons offered no relief. His world had contracted into a permanent, agonizing darkness, punctuated only by the terrifying sounds of his physicians and the relentless onslaught of their treatments. The physical reality of his existence had become so grotesque that the opulent surroundings of the palace felt like a cruel mockery. The tapestries woven with gold thread and the silk sheets upon his bed were now routinely soaked in sweat, urine, and the foul-smelling purulent discharge from his ruined scalp. We must deeply examine the physiological nightmare unfolding within the child's body to grasp the true scale of the catastrophe Hérouard was orchestrating. The fundamental condition, hydrocephalus, was aggressively destroying the architecture of his brain. The cerebrospinal fluid, unable to drain naturally, was expanding the ventricles, the cavities deep within the brain structure. As these cavities ballooned, They compressed the soft, vital brain tissue against the unyielding interior of the skull. This compression was the source of his profound neurological collapse. The optic nerves, highly sensitive to intracranial pressure, had been crushed, plunging him into total blindness. The motor pathways were severely damaged, resulting in the rigid, agonizing spasms of opisthotonos that bowed his spine and locked his limbs. Yet, the natural progression of hydrocephalus was only a fraction of the horror. The medical interventions had introduced entirely new, lethal complications. The repeated application of red-hot irons had destroyed the protective layers of skin and muscle on his scalp, leaving the underlying bone exposed and necrotic. The massive blisters induced by the Spanish fly had stripped away vast areas of the epidermis. These open, weeping wounds were a catastrophic breach of his immune system. In the unsterile environment of the 17th century, where bandages were reused and the concept of bacteria was entirely unknown, infection was absolute and inevitable. The prince was suffering from severe systemic sepsis. The putrid smell that filled his chamber, which Henri stubbornly recorded as the successful venting of corrupted humors, was the undeniable stench of rotting tissue. Bacteria had colonized the burnishars and the raw blister beds, multiplying rapidly and infiltrating his bloodstream. This rampant infection triggered relentless burning fevers that consumed his rapidly depleting energy reserves. His heart raced constantly, struggling to pump thick, dehydrated blood through a failing circulatory system. Simultaneously, the insidious toxicity of the cantharides was completing its destruction of his renal system. The blistering paste, repeatedly smeared across his highly vascularized scalp, had delivered a massive dose of cantharidin directly into his body. His kidneys, the vital organs responsible for filtering toxins and maintaining fluid balance, were shutting down. The swelling in his limbs, noted meticulously by Henri, was severe edema. The child was experiencing uremia, a condition where the waste products normally excreted in urine build up to toxic levels in the blood. This internal poisoning caused uncontrollable vomiting, further dehydration, and a profound lethargic delirium that Henri tragically misinterpreted as the cold humors finally extinguishing the child's vital heat. The psychological landscape of the sick room was as harrowing as the physical. The prince was entirely stripped of his agency and his humanity in the eyes of his caregivers. He was no longer treated as a frightened, suffering toddler, but as a defective vessel containing a hostile fluid. When he screamed during the application of the irons or the lancing of the blisters, his terror was ignored. When he fell into exhausted, unresponsive silences, it was merely noted as a shift in humoral balance. He was surrounded by adults who possessed absolute power over his body and who believed with terrifying certainty that their acts of violence were acts of salvation. For the blind child, every touch had become a potential threat. The approach of footsteps, the rustle of heavy fabric, the shift of the mattress, any of these could signal the beginning of another agonizing procedure. He was trapped in a state of hyperarousal and learned helplessness, his nervous system shattered by chronic pain. The daily routine recorded in the royal journals from August and September of 1611 is a testament to the sheer endurance of the human body under siege. Eroward's entries describe a relentless cycle of interventions. If the child seemed weak, he was forced to swallow highly concentrated, irritating broths meant to stimulate his internal heat. If he convulsed, he was restrained, and fresh blisters were applied to draw the violent humors away from his head. The doctors even engaged in complex debates about the timing of the treatments, arguing over whether it was more efficacious to apply the burning irons when the moon was waxing or waning, adhering to the astrological tenets intertwined with humoral theory. Their intellectual rigidity blinded them to the obvious reality that their patient was dying of the cures. The presence of Queen Marie de Médicis added a heavy layer of political anxiety to the Grey and proceedings. She visited the nursery frequently, trailing a retinue of ladies-in-waiting and courtiers. These visits were highly choreographed performances of royal grief. The queen would weep, pray violently at the foot of the bed, and demand that the physicians do more. She commanded that masses be said in cathedrals across Paris, seeking divine intervention where medicine was clearly failing. Yet her maternal desperation did not translate into an intervention to stop the torture. She was paralyzed by the authority of the medical establishment. To order Henri to stop the cauterization would be to take personal responsibility for the child's death. It was easier to allow the physicians to continue their gruesome work, transferring the burden of the inevitable failure onto the limitations of science rather than the limits of her own power. As autumn arrived, the leaves falling in the gardens of Saint-Germain-en-Laye mirrored the final precipitous decline of the Duke of Orleans. His body, systematically broken by disease and medicine, began its final shutdown. The seizures became almost continuous, racking his emaciated frame with violent tremors. He could no longer swallow the forced broths, leading to severe malnutrition. His breathing became shallow and labored as the infection spread to his lungs. The massive swelling of his head had stretched the skin so tightly that the blood vessels were starkly visible, tracing a dark, jagged web across his skull. Henri, however, remained entirely composed. His journal entries from October show no sign of panic or admission of defeat. He continued to precisely document the volume of fluid drained from the blisters, the color of the child's scant urine, and the exact duration of each convulsion. He was a man meticulously recording the data of an experiment that had already catastrophically failed, entirely disconnected from the human agony he was observing. The medical machine he commanded had ground the child down to the very edge of death, yet it continued to operate on pure momentum, unable to stop until the vital spark was completely extinguished. The tragedy had entered its final act, a slow, agonizing slide into oblivion, watched over by the greatest minds of France who still believed, against all evidence, that they were waging a righteous war against the humors. By November of 1611, the 4-year-old Duke of Orleans had been reduced to a state of profound physiological collapse. The changing weather outside the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye brought a bitter chill back to the stone quarters, mirroring the fading heat within the child's battered body. The relentless fevers had burned away whatever fat reserves he possessed, leaving his skin stretched tightly over fragile, prominent bones. His breathing was now a shallow, ragged rasp, often pausing for terrifyingly long intervals as his brainstem struggled to maintain basic autonomic functions. The journals from these final 2 weeks are a testament to a terrifying medical stubbornness. Even as the prince slipped in and out of a deep coma, rendering him entirely unresponsive to the voices of his nurses or his mother, the treatments did not cease. On the days when his tiny body was racked by final violent paroxysms, his spine arching so severely that his head nearly touched his heels, Henri and the attending physicians interpreted these death throes as the cold humors making a final, aggressive assault. Their response was as predictable as it was tragic. They ordered fresh blistering paste applied to the few remaining patches of unscarred skin on his limbs, desperately trying to draw the lethal fluids away from his failing heart and lungs. The end came on the 17th of November, 1611. It was not a peaceful passing. Héroard recorded the event with his characteristic chilling precision. He noted that the prince suffered a very long paroxysm that lasted through the morning, finally ceasing his struggle not far from 2II in the afternoon. The 4-year ordeal of the boy, who had only ever been known as Monsieur d'Orléans, was finally over. The official cause of death, dutifully entered into the royal records by the first physician, was the inevitable triumph of an unfathomable hydrocephalus. The immediate aftermath was dictated by strict court protocol. The Queen Regent, Marie de Médicis, was said to be inconsolable, collapsing into profound grief at the loss of her second son. The royal household was immediately draped in heavy black mourning cloth, and the immense machinery of state funerals was set into motion. Yet amidst the genuine sorrow, there was not a single murmur of dissent regarding the medical care the child had received. The Queen continued to employ Jean Héroard, retaining him as the chief physician for her surviving children, including the young King Louis XIII. The absolute authority of the medical establishment remained entirely unquestioned. They believed they had done everything within their immense power. It was simply accepted that the disease had proven too strong. However, the historical record of this case does not end with the prince's final breath. In a remarkable and scientifically crucial decision, Héroard requested and received permission to perform an autopsy on the royal corpse. In the early 17th century, opening the body of a prince of the blood was a rare and highly sensitive procedure, usually reserved for cases of suspected poisoning. But Héroard was driven by a clinical obsession to see the internal mechanics of the disease he had battled for so long. The autopsy he performed offers us a forensic window into the true cause of the child's unimaginable suffering. When Héroard opened the child's swollen skull, the physical evidence of his own catastrophic failure was laid bare on the table. He documented an immense quantity of fluid dilating the ventricles of the brain, confirming the initial diagnosis of severe hydrocephalus. But the state of the surrounding tissue told a far more horrific story. Héroard noted that the brain matter itself was entirely softened, friable, and liquefied. It was, in his own words, completely filled with pus and corrupted material. He was looking at a massive, fatal brain abscess. More damning still was his examination of the cranial bones. Héroard recorded that the internal surfaces of the frontal and parietal bones, the exact locations where he had repeatedly applied the red-hot cauterizing irons, were thinned to the transparency of paper. Furthermore, he noted that these bones were physically dead, corrupted, and riddled with small perforations. He had literally documented the fact that his burning irons had cooked the bone and created open pathways directly into the child's brain cavity. The putrid smell he had noted in the final weeks, the relentless fevers, the massive swelling, it was all the result of a catastrophic iatrogenic infection. By repeatedly destroying the protective barrier of the scalp and skull, he had introduced lethal bacteria straight into the child's central nervous system. The child's immune system, already severely compromised by the toxic cantharides attacking his kidneys, stood no chance against the massive sepsis. This autopsy table should have been the site of a profound medical reckoning. The physical proof that the theory of humors was fatally flawed was staring Héroard in the face. The pus was not stagnant phlegm. It was the direct result of the third-degree burns he had intentionally inflicted. The perforated skull was not the work of a disease, but the mechanical damage of his surgical tools. Yet cognitive dissonance prevailed entirely. Héroard did not recognize his error. He looked at the ruined bone and the liquefied brain and concluded that the hydrocephalus was simply so pernicious, so inherently corrosive, that it had rotted the child from the inside out. He used the very evidence of his medical malpractice to validate his initial diagnosis. He closed the body, washed his hands, and closed his journal on Monsieur d'Orléans, completely blind to the fact that he was looking at the victim of his own heroic medicine. The child was sent to the Basilica of Saint-Denis to be buried among his ancestors, taking the physical evidence of his torture with him into the dark. The lead coffin of the young prince was sealed and transported in a somber procession to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the ancient necropolis of the French kings, just north of Paris. He was placed in the damp, crowded crypts alongside generations of his ancestors. In the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, the heavy black mourning drapes were eventually taken down, the windows were opened to let in the winter air, and the physical space he had occupied in the royal nursery was swiftly reclaimed. The Bourbon dynasty was a massive political machine, and it abhorred a vacuum. The child's younger brother, Gaston, born just a year after him, was seamlessly elevated to fill the void. Gaston inherited the prestigious title of Duke of Orléans, entirely erasing the 4-year-old's brief claim to the name. To the French court, the line of succession remained secure. The loss of a child, while deeply mourned by the Queen, was viewed as a structural inevitability of 17th century life, a tragic but expected toll exacted by nature. What makes the aftermath of his death truly chilling is the absolute lack of institutional reflection. The brutal medical regimen that had dominated the prince's final years was never subjected to scrutiny. Jean Héroard, the first physician who had systematically documented his own malpractice, faced no professional consequences. In fact, his meticulous record-keeping only bolstered his reputation as a dedicated and attentive doctor. He continued his daily oversight of the royal nursery, applying the exact same humoral theories, the same harsh purgatives and the same terrifying bleedings to the surviving children of Henri IV. King Louis XIII would grow into a deeply hypochondriacal adult, forever psychologically scarred by the invasive and painful medical terrors of his youth. Yet his physical constitution allowed him to survive Héroard's care. The prince's sister, Henrietta Maria, would eventually cross the Channel to become the Queen of England, surviving both her childhood illnesses and her physicians. The survival of these siblings was celebrated by the court as undeniable proof of the medical establishment's skill. The agonizing death of Monsieur d'Orléans was compartmentalized, written off as an aggressive anomaly where the internal humors were simply too cold, too stubborn, and too corrupt to be conquered by even the most heroic interventions. The medical dogma that killed the prince remained fiercely unchallenged for another 2 centuries. The autopsy that Héroard performed, the very autopsy that clearly demonstrated how his burning irons had pierced the skull and introduced lethal infection to the brain, was filed away in his extensive journals as a mere curiosity. It was not used to reform surgical practices or question the application of chemical vesicants. The physical evidence of catastrophic medical failure was entirely neutralized by the absolute authority of ancient texts. Humorism maintained its iron grip on European medical faculties, condemning countless other patients, both royal and common, to similar forms of state-sanctioned, well-intentioned torture under the guise of healing. Epilogue. The story of Monsieur d'Orléans forces us to confront a deeply unsettling truth about human history and the nature of care. The greatest threat to this 4-year-old child was not malice, neglect, or even the underlying disease itself. The absolute greatest threat to his life was unquestioned certainty. The highly educated physicians who strapped a toddler to a wooden chair and applied red-hot irons to his skull did not do so out of cruelty. They carried out these horrific acts out of a desperate, terrifyingly misguided compassion. They loved him and valued his life enough to torture him because the rigid, theoretical foundations of their entire worldview told them it was the only possible path to salvation. If this same child were born today, his medical journey would be fundamentally different. A modern pediatric neurologist would diagnose the hydrocephalus swiftly and painlessly using magnetic resonance imaging. The treatment would not involve charcoal forges or the toxic crushed bodies of blister beetles. A simple surgically implanted tube known as a shunt would be placed to safely drain the excess cerebrospinal fluid from his brain into his abdomen. The success rate for this modern procedure is overwhelming. The child would not be strapped down in terror. He would be safely anesthetized. He would not be burned. He would be healed. He would grow up with a small, easily hidden scar beneath his hair. He would go to school, and he would be given a proper name. This vast, profound chasm between his agonizing reality in 1611 and our present capabilities is the true legacy of his short life. He stands as a permanent historical monument to the extreme dangers of theoretical dogma and the profound moral necessity of empirical, evidence-based science. We look back at the brief existence of this royal toddler not just with historical pity, but with a stark realization. His suffering is a permanent reminder that when a society prioritizes rigid, untested theories over observable physical reality, compassion itself can easily be weaponized into cruelty. The quiet, empty space he left behind in the French royal nursery is a testament to the fragile beauty of the human experience, and a lasting warning that our deepest, most passionate convictions must always remain open to the truth of the evidence before us.